We're 5 days away from U.S. President-elect Donald Trump's inauguration, and the threat of 25% tariffs continues to loom over Alberta. Over the weekend, Alberta Premier Danielle Smith went down to Mar-a-Lago, where she visited with the incoming president, but she's warning that there's no sign Alberta will be granted an exemption from the tariffs. Joining me today to discuss is True North Alberta reporter Isaac Lamoureuxto. I'm Rachel Parker. Welcome back to the Rachel Parker Show. Hey everyone, I'm Rachel Parker. Welcome back to the Rachel Parker Show. We are going to be diving into U.S. President-elect Donald Trump's looming threat of 25% tariffs and all the latest that Alberta Premier Danielle Smith has said about it. My colleague Isaac Lamoureuxto, who has taken over the Alberta beat and is doing an excellent job of it, is here to break it all down for us. So hello, Isaac. Thank you for being here. I want to start right off the hop. Obviously, we've known that Trump has been promising these tariffs for about 2 months now. How is Alberta Premier Danielle Smith positioning Alberta? What's the latest that she said in her hopes of trying to secure an energy exemption from those tariffs for the province?
Yeah, so following Smith's meeting with Donald Trump at Mar-a-Lago, what took me most by surprise, because I expected Smith to come back and say, hey, we talked about this, maybe we can make this happen. But no, she essentially said, look, these tariffs are coming, whether we like them or not. How are we going to deal with them once we see that they are implemented? And we're paying 25% tariffs on all the goods, of which obviously will decimate our economy. But Smith's really tried to position not only Alberta, but Canada as an energy behemoth. And it's like she's keeps talking about how much energy Canada supplies the United States at a discounted price, I might add. And we've seen other premiers not take that position initially, but I think they're starting to follow suit, because we saw, for example, Ontario Premier Doug Ford recently with his Can-Am proposal, which is along the same lines of improving the current existing electricity and energy grids between Ontario and the United States. So positioning ourselves as a supplier to the United States to avoid the tariffs.
We know that Federal Foreign Affairs Minister Melanie Joly was asked if she would consider cutting off the energy supply to the United States, and she said that nothing is off the table. How did Danielle Smith respond to this?
Yeah, I mean, Smith basically positioned this statement from Joly as ridiculous, as you might imagine. She said, Smith did, quote, "You should never threaten something you can't do." Because look, she said to Joly, pick up a map and look where Line 5 goes. If you cut off the United States, you're cutting off Ontario and Quebec. I mean, obviously you can't do that. It's a ridiculous statement to begin with. And Smith kind of laughed it off, because obviously Joly has no idea what she's talking about when she made such a claim.
I think we actually have the Premier's very fulsome response to this question. Take a look at Alberta Premier Danielle Smith responding to Foreign Affairs Minister Melanie Joly's suggestion that Canada should cut off the energy supply to the United States. Take a look.
Yesterday, Foreign Affairs Minister Melanie Joly talked about, she was asked specifically if in negotiations with Trump, Canada would consider an energy embargo on the United States. And I want to, as leverage, what do you think, what do you make of what she said?
Well, first of all, it's oil and gas that's owned by the provinces, principally Alberta, and we won't stand for that. And you should never, ever threaten something you cannot do. And I would encourage the minister to look at a map of where Line 5 goes. Line 5 comes down through Michigan to get to Sarnia, and then that feeds the bulk of the supply needed for Ontario and connects with Line 9, which feeds the bulk of the product needed for Quebec. And so if you cut off that line, you are cutting off Ontario and Quebec. So I would encourage the ministers to either understand how our integrated pipeline system works, and start looking at ways that we would be able to practically respond. because there's no point in making empty threats that cannot be executed on. So there are other things I'm sure that that we'll all talk about collectively, but let's just remember how integrated our markets are with the Enbridge system, the TC Energy system, that we have a product going back and forth across the border every single day. And we cannot do anything that harms Canadians in such a substantial way. So I just don't take that as a credible threat. I'm sure that the US administration won't either. So we should talk about things that we actually can do as opposed to empty threats.
So in that clip, you hear the Premier say a couple of times, we should focus on practical solutions, things that we actually can do to respond to the Trump administration and the incoming tariffs. As you said, Isaac, Danielle Smith is saying it seems pretty likely that we are going to see these tariffs come into effect on January 20th. So what are some of those practical things, those actual solutions and responses that she's talking about? What are some of those things that she's suggested that Alberta can do? Is she looking at retaliatory measures?
No, and I kind of alluded to that earlier, wherein Ontario Premier Doug Ford was, of course, the first premier to call for retaliatory measures, and at the time, Smith said, in no way, shape, or form are we considering that. She was really trying to emphasize collaboration over retaliation. A few things I wanted to add based on the stuff you said there, which first, this one's interesting. Obviously, Trudeau has announced his resignation, so he is still prime minister, but he will resign once a leader is chosen in the leadership election. So Smith has said that she's been actually negotiating and speaking with U.S. administration independently because Trudeau really has no public mandate to govern. So she's kind of been doing it herself. And another thing is the premiers are meeting today with Trudeau to discuss the tariff threats. So some stuff might come of that. We'll have to see. And they're also planning to meet roughly a month after Trump is inaugurated in Washington, D.C. to discuss how the tariffs are affecting all Canadians, which, I mean, it won't be no surprise. They're going to be terrible for our economy and the United States is, in theory, if they do come to be. So, I mean, that's a month after the tariffs are supposed to be implemented. So we'll see what even happens there.
I want to talk a little bit more about Justin Trudeau in a second. I just have sort of one last tidbit on Danielle Smith. You know, she's also warning that if Ottawa sought to do this, it would create a national unity crisis. And to me, living here in Alberta, I know you live up in Edmonton, it often feels like we are on the bit of the cusp of a national unity crisis with the Trudeau government and Albertans being so frustrated, feeling so targeted. I remember growing up and learning about, you know, the West wants in, the movement of Western provinces saying that they felt left behind. And I feel like we're feeling a lot of those sentiments right now. So here's Danielle Smith saying what the impact of a cutting off the energy supply would be. Take a look.
Well, they will have a national unity crisis on their hands at the same time as having a crisis with our U.S. trade partners. We just won't stand for that. And I don't think Ontarians and Quebec should stand for that as well. They shouldn't be standing by and listening while a federal minister talks about cutting off their energy supply. That's just not on. That makes no sense.
It's interesting seeing this clip as we're in the midst, as you mentioned, of a Liberal leadership race. How much more difficult, if the federal government chooses to go ahead with this, how much more difficult would that make the task of the next Liberal leader and prime minister at a point when Alberta specifically and other Western provinces, but I think Alberta at the helm of that, feels so frustrated with Ottawa?
Yeah, and Ontario Premier Doug Ford has touched on this briefly. Obviously, he's the chair of the Council of the Federation, informally known as Canada's Premiers, and he said, look, we know this leadership race is going on, which is a huge distraction for the Prime Minister and all Liberal MPs, but the number one focus of Trudeau needs to be on these tariffs. This is the biggest threat to our country right now. The leadership election's kind of just some distraction. It's funny. Harper, in a recent podcast interview, he mentioned something along those lines. He was saying that the new Liberal PM, whoever that may be, is going to be in an untenable position wherein they're going to have to support the Liberal Party's platform and say how good it is during the election, evidently, and then only have a few weeks until a federal election takes place where they've just presented themselves as this liberal bastion, but Canadians are done with the Liberal Party and their platform. So he basically said, look, they're going to need a miracle to win. They're in an impossible situation where they're obviously not going to win.
You're talking about how everyone's saying this really needs to be Trudeau's focus, even though he is a lame duck prime minister. And yet you reported this week that Justin Trudeau is actually planning on holding his final caucus retreat over Trump's inauguration. So is Justin Trudeau even going to be attending the inauguration?
Yeah, so I reached out to the Prime Minister's office because they're holding this retreat in Quebec the day of Donald Trump's inauguration. So I thought to myself, well, it's very unlikely that Trudeau will be there. I guess there's some small possibility where he could jet away from this retreat quickly to be at the inauguration, though extremely unlikely. So I reached out to the PMO and they didn't get back to me. Of course, we've been talking about Danielle Smith. She is attending the inauguration in person after being personally invited. So I also asked whether Trudeau had even been invited. Some people on X have suggested that he hasn't. But interestingly, also Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre, he won't be attending. So I don't know if in the past opposition leaders have attended inaugurations, but he won't be going. But yeah, no, the interesting thing about Trudeau's retreat is he said he's holding this retreat to figure out how to deal with the tariff threats and how to deal with that. But I was thinking to myself, would going to the inauguration and speaking with Trump, which he'd no doubt be able to do at some point, not be the best way to address the tariff threats? Say, hey, man, how can we work this out? I'm seeing you eye to eye, man to man, and negotiate right there. I don't know what him being in Quebec with a bunch of his close friends or MPs is going to accomplish.
Yeah, it seems a little bit like they're just trying to, get while the going is good. One last nice big holiday vacation for them that taxpayers will foot the bill for, of course. You mentioned former Conservative Prime Minister Stephen Harper. He has been pretty quiet since he left office, but he did a fulsome interview this week covering some of the trade war and Donald Trump's jokes about making Canada the 51st state. In a fulsome interview this week, I think Canadians were happy and pleased to hear from him. I have a clip that I want to play for you guys where he's talking a little bit about the fault of Justin Trudeau. Take a look.
Yeah, look, I have no doubt that there's clearly animosity there, and for good reason. I mean, Mr. Trudeau's conduct with Mr. Trump on numerous occasions when they were in office together was not professional, and I can understand why there's some animosity. But look, whether or not we have Mr. Trudeau as our prime minister is our choice as Canadians. We don't tell you who to elect as president of the United States. And so as much as I'm glad to see Mr. Trudeau leaving, this is not Mr. Trump's decision. It's the decision of Canadians. Ultimately, it was the decision of Mr. Trudeau's own party.
So it's certainly nice to hear from somebody who is, so well-reasoned there. I think that's really lost in politics. You hear a lot more inflammatory rhetoric. But what Harper's saying is ultimately very true and wise. He's saying, Justin Trudeau has not helped the situation with Donald Trump. But unlike, as we're seeing, especially a lot of outlets in the States say, Trudeau's not leaving because of Trump. Sure, it was another stressor on an already failing prime minister, but Canadians and ultimately Liberals finally, found the strength, if you want to say. They finally had enough and said that it was mostly fear when they saw the poll numbers for their party. But, they were finally able to tell Trudeau it's over, and he got the boot from that. So ultimately, you listened to this interview with Stephen Harper and you reported on it. Who is he blaming for the trade war that's breaking out?
Yeah, no, this was a very interesting interview. Obviously, Harper sat down with Gabriel Groisman for about 30 minutes. And he said a lot of things. So when I was writing my article, it was hard to even fit it into one. I could have arguably done 3 separate articles on the things that Harper mentioned. That's how many salient things he brought up. But in the short, he essentially broke down all the recent statements by Trump, rebuking a lot of them, but also noting where some had value. So, for example, Harper said, quote, "I must admit to being shocked by some of the things he said. I have a real problem with some of the things Donald Trump is saying. Doesn't sound to me like the pronouncements of somebody who's a friend, a partner, and an ally, which is what I've always thought the United States is for our country. And interestingly, Harper positioned himself as the most pro-American prime minister in Canada's history. I don't know how people feel about that necessarily, but I did find that pretty intense of a statement. But where Harper agreed with Trump was, of course, the border crisis, which he called a, quote, enormous problem. He even went on to say that he's actually close friends with Joe Biden, but he criticized his administration's disgraceful, that's what he said, open border policies. And he even went on to say that, quote, it was a violation of his fundamental duties to the country, those open border policies. But even with the border critique, Harper said that the migrant flow from Canada to the USA is minor compared to that of Mexico, and that drugs, crime, and guns are really flowing into Canada from the US, not vice versa. And of course, he went on and discussed the tariffs, as everyone said, that we're selling the US oil at a reduced price. So I don't know what the problem is there. And then he spent a lot of the interview, as you might imagine, criticizing Trudeau for waging war against Canada's resources like mining and energy. And he said that Poilievre will turn that right around, along with Trudeau's overbearing tax regime. So that's interesting. He also said some pretty noteworthy things of Trudeau and left-wing governments in general. He said that when Trudeau first took office, he really presented himself as a centrist prime minister, a centrist government. But Harper said he quickly shifted to the far left, and he said, "Oh, we won't change Harper's policies too much. We'll just shift it a little bit." But then, of course, when they said they'll only tax the rich a bit and spend a little bit, Trudeau's government has, as you know, spent more than every government before it combined. Because, of course, when Trudeau took office, the national debt was $616 billion, and he has since doubled it to over $1.24 trillion. So, yeah, no, Harper said, look, he spent a lot and he's taxed everyone a lot. Another very interesting and salient point that Harper brought up, which I was shocked to hear, was that he said Trudeau, he's like, I shouldn't discredit Trudeau too much. He won 3 elections, but he only did so because of the media conglomerate behind him, essentially spreading propaganda. That's the word Harper used. But he said, look, that's not going to work anymore because essentially the legacy media has lost their sway over Canadians. Independent media, social media, they have too much power. The legacy media can't, in its own, win a prime minister an election as it may have been able to in the past. I mean, I could go through this forever, Rachel. There's so many things that he brought up. Just a few other things. He really said that all of Trudeau's policies were terrible. Bad economy. He said the policies he implemented are anti-Canadian, and that the federal government has essentially resulted in a useless public sector, which, as we know, Rachel, is like half the jobs in Canada at this point. I mean, it's so bloated, it's insane. And then he actually predicted that Poilievre will be prime minister by early May. So I don't know how Canadians are going to feel about that, but that's obviously before the latest point the election could take place in October. So interesting to see Harper say that. And yeah, that pretty much covers the interview in short. As I said, there were so many interesting things that Harper went through in this interview. I suggest anyone listening could give it a listen. You'd enjoy it, I imagine.
Well, I don't know if my audience needs to now because you really have all the details on what happened there. So thank you very much for that. Thanks for joining us today, Isaac. That is Isaac Lamoureuxto, True North Alberta correspondent and host, of course, of the Alberta Roundup. Okay, everyone, that's all we have time for today. I hope that you guys have a great week and weekend. I'll be back next week. God bless.